Hello, everybody. Welcome to com3047, Week 4. This is Persuasion, Influence, and Social Change. And this week's chapter, we're covering Chapter 5 in your textbook. And this week, we're talking about your audience because audience is a critical part of every persuasive attempt. Now, there is no single underlying trait or characteristic that makes people persuadable. Although I can tell you at times I'm quite gullible, it takes the right set of circumstances and context for me to be gullible. Persuasion is complicated. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. However, the characteristics of the people in a persuasive interaction cannot be ignored. All communicators are unique in terms of gender, age, personality, and background. And those characteristics are important to understanding the nature of social influence. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at specific characteristics of your audience and how they affect the persuadability of your audience. We're going to start with an easy one, age. The expression is, it's like taking candy from a baby. That expression suggests that children are easy targets for persuasion, and research indicates that that is generally true. Young children are especially vulnerable to persuasive appeals. As a matter of fact, your book contains a box 5.1 on pages 106, 107 that shows that children are highly susceptible to persuasive tactics from strangers. There's a brief list of lures and prevention strategies there that deal with the way that strangers take advantage of children. And so we know that children are vulnerable to persuasive attempts. Just like strangers and these people who seek to do harm to children target children, advertisers also target children. They use several devices to persuade children and to attract children's attention. Because unfortunately, children are not equipped with the knowledge that advertisers are not necessarily trying to help them, but rather are trying to make money off of them or their parents. So children tend to believe everything that they hear. Now, there are two factors that can be used to combat against that vulnerability. The first is obvious. As they age, they become wiser in the ways of the world and more aware of persuasive attempts. The second is not so obvious, but makes perfect sense once you consider it. If a parent or other trusted adult figure takes the time to point out the influence attempts and educate kids, they become more resistant to persuasion efforts faster. Now you may say, why are we starting with kids? Well, here's the reason why. There's a correlation that you may not have considered before. Older people are much like younger people in this regard. They are more vulnerable to persuasion attempts. This is because as you age, your cognitive ability deteriorates, and compliance professionals know that they increase their chance of success by targeting the aged, the elderly, those with lower cognitive function. I once knew a shady individual who owned a siding business, and the reason I knew him is I was working for a billboard design business, and he was doing some advertising with us. And it didn't take very long sitting and talking to him about brand messaging and advertising before we began to realize, or I began to realize, that he specifically targeted older homeowners. He wasn't interested in middle-aged homeowners. He wasn't real interested in whether they were affluent or less affluent. He wanted one thing. He wanted the elderly, because he had learned that if he could make a small sale, sell them some vinyl siding, get his foot in the door, then they would buy from him just about anything that he was selling. It was far too easy to convince them that they needed new storm windows, that they needed a new gutter system, or even a new roof. And they didn't even bat an eye at it, because these are people with disposable income. They've got money saved. This is their life savings. This is what they intend to live on. But he's taking advantage of their age and basically helping himself to their savings. Now, while I'm on the subject of declining cognitive ability, let me point out one that targets people from every age demographic. Have you ever been exposed to late night radio or late night TV advertising? some of the oddest items come up for sale in the overnight time slots. Now, you may think that these odd items are advertised there because that's the only thing that those advertisers can afford. After all, they're definitely not mainstream marketing efforts. But if you decided they were just there because they were relegated to that position, you would be completely wrong. These advertisers target these spots because late at night, when you're tired, well, it happened again. My video locked up and shut down on me right in the middle of my passionate plea. What I was saying was late at night, when you're tired, when you're sleepy, whenever you're not thinking real well, that's when your cognitive ability declines. And they target you then because you're vulnerable then. It doesn't matter what your age is. It doesn't matter what your educational level is. It only matters that you're vulnerable. The next day you'll wake up scratching your head wondering, why in the world did I buy that? I can tell you why you bought that. It's because you were targeted when you were vulnerable. This is what late night hucksters understand. Now, getting back to the lecture, the life stage hypothesis suggests that there is a curvilinear relationship between age and persuasion. What that means is that compared to youthful and elderly people, middle-aged people are generally less persuadable because of their heightened cognitive ability. Of course, that doesn't apply late at night. Next, let's consider gender differences. Which gender is more persuasive, men or women? How about persuadability? Which is the easier to persuade, men or women? Now, the answer to those questions may be surprising to you because, first of all, the research is less than consistent. The research tends to show, or at least the early research tended to show, that males are more persuasive than females. However, later research indicates that that result may be skewed. It may not be based on the actual ability or skill of the males involved in the study, as much as it's based on the bias of the people doing the study. In general, gender stereotypes cause audiences to perceive males as being more competent than females, and to expect females to be warmer and more nurturing than males. So because of that, women experience what's called a double bind. They must not only perform better than men to be considered equally competent to men, they also are perceived negatively when they try to be more direct and assertive and forceful. In other words, there's a perception handicap in those studies that favors the males in the research. Reinforcement expectancy theory attempts to explain this. In a study of medical professionals, they determined that female doctors, as compared to male doctors, were at a disadvantage when influencing patients because they were constrained by stereotypes regarding the appropriate influence tactics for females to use. That bias put them in a box that handicaps them from the word go. The same trend shows up in studies about which gender is more persuadable. Early studies indicated that women were more persuadable than men, but later studies find no such difference between men and women. So if you're looking for generalizations about persuasion in regard to gender and how gender relates to persuasion, they're hard to come by. Some differences may be found from study to study, but they may exist less because of gender differences and more because of a few isolated factors. For instance, women are more empowered today than they once were, which produces results today that are inconsistent with older data. Also, the gender of both parties in a persuasion attempt matters. There's what is called the cross-sex effect, in which people in general are more persuaded by members of the opposite sex than they are by members of the same sex. So it matters who's doing the persuading and who is being persuaded. And in this case, gender matters, but not because there's not gender equality, but because the genders are affected more by the opposite gender. Finally, men and women have different goals, different plans, different beliefs, and different resources, and all these differences can translate to differences in persuasion results that have nothing at all really to do with gender. All right, so now let's talk about ethnicity and culture and persuasion. Cultural differences play a major role, both in terms of how people fashion influence attempts and how they respond to them. Perhaps the most commonly discussed dimension of cultural variability is known as individualism versus collectivism. People in a collectivist culture, like in China, tend to value harmony, concern for others, and the goals of the group over the goals of the individual. While people in individualistic cultures, like in the United States, tend to value independence and the goals of the individual over the goals of the collective. Because of this, individualistic cultures are more persuaded by appeals to independence and personal benefit, while collectivist cultures are more persuaded by appeals to harmony and group goals and concern for others. People from individualistic cultures tend to view themselves consistently across situations, while those in collectivist cultures tend to view themselves as being more susceptible to change. So unlike gender, culture seems to be an important variable in persuasion studies. The text on page 194 details some interesting influence tactics that are culture specific, particularly dealing with individualist cultures as they compare to collectivist cultures. Now, I don't know if you can hear it. I'm sitting in my office and there's a crop duster buzzing the church as it sprays the field right beside us. If you can hear that, I apologize for that. It is what it is. Next, let's consider intelligence. Your text asks an interesting question. Imagine that you were offered $1 million if you could successfully persuade either Forrest Gump or Albert Einstein to believe or do something. Which one would you choose? Forrest Gump, for those that don't know, is perceived as the mental midget, while Albert Einstein is perceived as a mental giant. Well, if you turn to the research to decide which one would be easier to persuade, you might be disappointed because the research on that subject is changing. Just like the gender problem, there's a shift in how intelligence is believed to affect persuadability. The early research suggested that moderately intelligent people were more persuadable because highly intelligent people, like Albert Einstein, were less likely to yield to a message, and less intelligent people, like Forrest Gump, were less likely to comprehend the message. So you would be best off trying to persuade somebody else because neither Gump nor Einstein were good candidates for persuasion. Recent research, however, suggests that less intelligent people are indeed easier to persuade. Remember the elaboration likelihood model that we've mentioned every week in this class? Less intelligent people are more likely to choose peripheral root processing, which makes them more vulnerable to persuasion triggers. Two common explanations for why people differ from one another centers on the notion of traits and states. A trait is a characteristic of a person that is presumed to be relatively stable across situations. If you have a character trait, it doesn't change with the situation. A state, however, varies from situation to situation. For instance, if we conceptualize anxiety as a trait, we would predict that a person possessing that trait would be anxious in practically all situations. On the other hand, if we conceptualize anxiety as a state, we would predict that there are certain situations in which a person becomes anxious. Researchers have examined various traits and states as they relate to persuasion in order to classify individuals based on their differences and explain why certain persuasive strategies are employed. What we're going to look at next are some things that can either be traits or states. They may be the permanent condition of an individual, or they may be prefaced on a particular context for the individual, but either way, they affect the persuasive effort. One factor that researchers have examined is self-esteem, either as a trait or a state. Their results indicate that people with moderately high self-esteem are more persuadable than people with very high or very low self-esteem. This works just like the intelligence thing earlier. People who are have a high self-esteem, they're going to be more resistant. And people who have a low self-esteem are going to be more resistant for opposite reasons, but they're still more resistant. Whereas those people who have moderately high self-esteem, they're going to be more vulnerable to a persuasion attempt. Another factor that has been considered is the aforementioned anxiety. And the relationship between anxiety and persuasion, however, is not clear. Anxious people do seem to be more vulnerable to persuasion than those who are not anxious. But extremely anxious people tend to react poorly to persuasion efforts that key in on anxiety. So it's anxious people are a little more persuadable when they're not too anxious. So there's kind of a fine line in there. Another factor that has been considered is the tendency to self-monitor. People who have traits of being a low self-monitor tend to be less sensitive than others to social cues. If you're one of those people, you're not concerned about what others may think about your behavior. You're individualistic, and you may not always act in ways that are considered to be socially appropriate in a given context. However, if you're a high self-monitor individual, then you tend to be very sensitive to social cues. You pay close attention to what's considered appropriate in a given situation, and you endeavor to do everything you can to act accordingly. You watch other people's behavior, and you're good at adapting to different audiences because you have a large repertoire of social skills. You're concerned with appearances, you try to fit in with others, and you do that to the extent that you may even do things that contradict what you believe in order to fit into the in group. Now, these characteristics become targets of persuasion professionals. For instance, high self-monitors are more easily persuaded to do things that make them fit in or look good. So they're vulnerable to image-based advertising. Whereas low self-monitors are more easily persuaded by the quality of a product. They don't care about the cool factor. They want functionality. They want high quality. So they're more vulnerable to product quality advertising. And surely you can think of both kinds of advertising, image-based advertising and product quality-based advertising. Now you can see the difference in what they're targeting. The image-based advertising is targeting those high self-monitors, while the product quality advertising is targeting those individuals that are low self-monitors. Now, last week's lecture focused on consistency. And it turns out that some people have a higher preference for consistency than others do, making them more vulnerable to consistency-based attacks. People with a high preference for consistency strive to be consistent, while those with a low preference to consistency or for consistency do not strive to be consistent. So those that are high preference for consistency are more susceptible or more vulnerable to the effects of cognitive dissonance than those with a low preference for consistency. So if you know you're dealing with an individual or individuals that are high level of consistency, they have a high preference for consistency, then the best way to target them is with a cognitive dissonance-based approach. What about how invested you are in the subject of a persuasion attempt? There's a theory called social judgment theory, and social judgment theory suggests that ego-involved people are difficult to persuade. Now, before you draw some type of conclusion about what I mean by ego-involved, let me explain it to you. First of all, social judgment theory suggests that on any given topic, there are a variety of possible positions. And every individual has one position that they prefer above all the others. If there are no mitigating factors, that is the position that they will take every single time. That position is called their anchor point. That's their anchor position. Now, there are other positions on the spectrum that a person might find acceptable and that might fall within what is called the latitude of acceptance. Now, there are other positions that a person might find acceptable, and they fall within what is called the latitude of acceptance. This is a broader position than the anchor point. However, They also have a latitude of rejection, which includes an even broader spectrum of positions that they absolutely find unacceptable and they will not accept under any conditions. In between that latitude of acceptance and that latitude of rejection, they have what is called a latitude of non-commitment. This is a range of neutral positions. So when I talk about an ego-involved person, what I'm saying is that person has a narrow latitude of acceptance and a narrow latitude of non-commitment, but a broad latitude of rejection. What that means is that the person is personally invested in the issue. It really matters to them. Their anchor point is solid. There's not a lot of wiggle room for them. That's what we mean when we say ego involved. It doesn't necessarily have to do with how egotistical they are. It has more to do with the fact that they are personally invested. Now, ego involved people tend to have a narrow latitude of acceptance, and because of that, they are more difficult to persuade. There's not very much wiggle room on their opinion of the subject. Now, if you attempt to persuade them and you try to persuade them to a position that's outside of that latitude of acceptance, they will reject it out of hand. That's called the contrast effect. Persuasion attempts with a goal that is in contrast with the anchor belief are rejected out of hand. There isn't any chance that they will succeed. However, when a persuasion attempt targets a different position than the anchor position, but a position that lies within the latitude of acceptance, that narrow range of acceptable positions that are slightly different from the anchor position, but are acceptable to the individual, those persuasion attempts are more successful. This is called the assimilation effect. And a persuasive message that starts further from the anchor and activates that contrast effect, then moves closer to the anchor and activates that assimilation effect, may be viewed by the individual as an acceptable compromise and can lead to a successful persuasion attempt. Now that matters. That results in the understanding that persuasion is not a one-shot deal. You can gradually nudge someone, even someone who's settled in a position, has a solid anchor position, you can gradually nudge them into a different position through a series of small compromises. Anchor positions are not set in stone. They can be moved, but they have to be moved slowly. And persuasion experts understand this. They never target the big change. Instead, they target a succession of smaller changes. They get you to budge just a little from your anchor point. Then the next persuasion attempt moves you just a little further. And it's always a small compromise. It's always a small step, but it gradually nudges you further and further away from your anchor position. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, I could stop and preach right here because the devil is an expert at this. This is exactly the way he attacks your faith. This is exactly the way he attacks your positions of righteousness and holiness and godliness. Just give a little here. Just give a little here. This is not as bad as that. It's the contrast principle. This is not as bad as that. It's just a little bit different from where I am now. And so you assimilate that into your belief structure. And then after a little bit, here comes another persuasion attempt. And this is not as bad, again, as the contrasting element. And so it can't be all bad. So there has to be an acceptable compromise. And slowly but surely, step by step, little by little, he nudges you away from your anchor position. You got to be sure to guard those anchors, those beliefs that are firm and settled. There are some things in your life, there should be no compromise on them. Can I get an amen? Woo, I hear you out there. Another thing that affects how people process messages is issue involvement, and that affects how persuadable they'll be. An individual's involvement can be ego-related or value-related, and when that's the case, the persuasive message is gauged by the enduring values that are rooted in the self-concept. Our ego drives our involvement in the issue. But sometimes our involvement with the issue centers around our current goals. That's called outcome-relevant involvement or issue involvement. And issue-involved people tend to scrutinize messages and are more easily persuaded by strong cognitive arguments, that central root processing. While people who are not involved in the issue, they don't have any investment in it, are more easily persuaded by peripheral cues. So when you encounter an issue that someone is invested in, that doesn't mean they're not persuadable. It just means that you have to approach them with a highly cognitive argument. You've got to use logos. You've got to come at them with something that is strong and appeals to their cognitive ability, because they're more likely to change. They're more likely to be persuaded if you put them on that central root processing. Another factor has to do with how authoritarian a person is. Authoritarian people respect authoritative leadership, and they tend to follow authority blindly. These are the soldiers who say, well, I only did it because I was following orders. They commit atrocities of war, and they fall back on, well, I was following orders. Those kind of people can be called dogmatic. They are closed-minded. They have difficulty being objective. They tend to believe that there's only one right way to do things, and that way is their way. And they tend to invest all of their thought process into what the authority has told them they should do. They're very persuaded by the authority. Now, you might think that such closed-mindedness makes them more difficult to persuade. Interesting enough, however, early research found them to be easier to persuade. Now, more recent research is less consistent. The research does bear out certain things, though. They're difficult to persuade unless the persuader is perceived to be an authority or an expert. Remember, these are people that are very vulnerable to authority. Then they are more persuaded by stronger arguments than they are by weaker arguments. So when they're receiving a persuasive message that comes from a non-expert, from a non-authority, they can still be persuaded, but you have to come at them from the central root processing. You can't come at them from peripheral positions. You have to make them think about it. And then finally, they are vulnerable to persuasive messages that are threatening. Things that threaten their position, things that threaten their identity. They're very vulnerable to those things. Now, your book considers a few other factors that have to do with the success of persuasion in your audience, but that's enough for now. I want to change gears and move on. The next thing that the chapter talks about is constructivism. Constructivism suggests that people interpret the world using a variety of constructs. Constructs are perceptual categories like fat and thin, popular and unpopular, strong and weak, conservative and liberal. And we use those kind of concepts or constructs to evaluate everything from professors to preachers to textbooks to music to arguments to anything. And constructs can be compared to eyeglasses. They're how we see the world. Just like the size and shape and color of a lens may affect the way you see things, the construct is the lens that you use to view the world, and you filter messages through that construct, and that construct influences the way that you perceive the world. Now, here's why that matters. Cognitively complex people interpret the world using a broader variety of constructs. Because of that, they're more tolerant of messages that are inconsistent with their personal beliefs. And cognitively simple people interpret the world using fewer constructs, and as a result, they're less tolerable of messages that are inconsistent with their beliefs. So people who are more cognitively complex compared to those who are not are better at seeing the world through their listeners' perspective. As a general rule, then, they are better at adapting their message to their listeners, and they're much better at being persuasive. Now, people who are high on the need for cognition enjoy things that provoke thought. They like to think, and they enjoy things that make them think. Therefore, if you're trying to persuade someone who is cognitively complex, they're more easily persuaded by strong arguments, central root processing. And if you're trying to persuade someone who is cognitively simple, they are more easily persuaded by peripheral cues, which makes them more vulnerable to persuasion triggers. Now let's talk about aggressive communication. Aggressive communication can be either destructive or constructive, or both, depending on the type of aggression and how it affects an interpersonal relationship. Verbal aggressiveness is the tendency to attack others verbally. It's aimed at damaging another person's self-concept. Whereas argumentiveness involves the tendency to refute and defend arguments without personal attacks. There are some folks who just like to argue. The two can be hard to differentiate unless you really know the difference. What is really argumentiveness can appear at times to be verbally aggressive, and what is really verbally aggressive can come off as being argumentative. The difference is the personal level of the attack. That's what makes the difference between verbal aggressiveness and argumentativeness. Now, verbally aggressive people, they have no filter. They do not edit their arguments. They pretty much say whatever comes to mind. Whereas people who are not verbally aggressive but are argumentative, they'll edit their arguments in order to avoid violating their own ethical standards. There are some things they just won't say. There are some things they just won't do. Even if it would make the key point for them in the argument, they're still not going to say it because they have an ethical standard that governs what they're going to say, and they have a filter that is applied. That's the difference between verbal aggression and argumentativeness. Now, aggression is a double-edged sword. It can be beneficial in some circumstances and can be detrimental in others. You want to know more about it? Look at the chapter. It has a little bit more than what I'm sharing with you. Finally, I want to wrap up with this question. What does all of this mean to persuasion? This is what it means. When you're trying to be persuasive, your audience really does matter. You have to analyze your audience and you have to adapt your message accordingly. Marketers accomplish this through what is called market segmentation. They tailor persuasive messages to particular audiences. And those audiences are groups that are based on demographic factors like age and zip codes and ethnicity and gender and education, economic status, career choice. But then they hone in on some of these things that we've been talking about today, and they try to find these different classes of individual, and they target their message specifically to those people who are vulnerable to that kind of persuasion effort. That allows them to target the message to the strengths and weaknesses of the audience. What that means to you is if you're going to be a public speaker, you're going to try to operate in the realm of persuasion. Maybe you're going to be in a public service job or a waiter or waitress or whatever, in a way that public service job where you need to be persuasive. It helps you make money. And you need to learn to recognize your audience, recognize who you're dealing with, and know what kind of persuasive effort works for them and on them. Now, hopefully, this lecture has made you more aware of how the various traits and states of your audience will influence your persuasive efforts. I know we haven't talked a lot about particular persuasive triggers this week, but the more you know about your audience, the better equipped you are to present them with a successful persuasion attempt. And that's what this chapter is all about. That wraps things up. I hope you have a great week. God bless you.